I would now like to move on to Mona Nilsson. She is the director of the Swedish Radiation Protection Foundation. She's also a former freelance journalist and author of 2 books on mobile phone health risks. Today, she will be speaking about why some experts deny the health risks of wireless radiation exposure, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, also known as ICNIRP, and the industry influence around this issue. Mona Nilsson, welcome to today. I know you've been instrumental in putting this all together. So I'm very happy to hand the floor over to you, and I'm looking forward to hear from your experience.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about the fact that many experts from some organizations agree that there are no health risks from this kind of radiation below the ICNIRP and the FCC limits. Next slide, please. The ICNIRP and the FCC limits are based on the same idea, which is an old idea established already half a century ago, that there are only acute thermal effects that is harmful from this kind of radiation. And those effects are observed within less than an hour in studies where animals have been exposed to very high intensities and that cause tissue heating within an hour. So those limits do offer no protection at all against all short and long-term effects at levels that are not caused by tissue heating. The telecommunications industry loves the ICNIRP and the FCC limits. They have over the years both pushed for the adoption of them and strongly defended them against any criticism. They consider lower limits as a risk to their business. Next slide, please. However, an increasing number of scientists all over the world are very critical to those limits, those very old dated limits. The ICBE EMF, for instance, stated in 2022 that the limits are based on false suppositions, do not adequately protect workers, children, hypersensitive individuals, and the general population for short-term or long-term RFR exposures. Similarly, the EMF Scientist Appeal in 2015 stated that those limits are insufficient to protect public health. The Scientist EMF Appeal is signed by 259 scientists from all around the world today. And in 2012, the Bioinitiative report concluded that bioeffects are clearly established to occur with very low exposure levels, and that the existing limits from FCC and ICNIRP do not sufficiently protect public health. Also, yet another example is the EMF call in 2018 that concluded that those limits pose a serious risk to human health and the environment since they allow harmful exposure. The EMF call is signed by 164 scientists and medical doctors. And those limits and the people that recommend them, the experts that recommend those limits, they ignore an amazing amount of evidence that show that those limits are not sufficient to protect against harmful effects. Professor Henry Lai has made a compilation of studies published between 1990 and 2023 available on saferemr.com. And you can see in the table that there are hundreds of studies showing oxidative, genetic, neurologic, and reproductive effects, and that those studies showing the harmful effects are in clear majority compared to those studies showing no effects. Next slide, please. So the limits recommended by ICNIRP are extremely high. They were first recommended by ICNIRP in 1998, and for 3G, 4G, 5G, they allow exposure full body at 10 million microwatts per square meter. And although there are no studies whatsoever showing that people can, in fact, be exposed to those very high levels without causing harm. And in 2020, ICNIRP updated their recommendations for allowed exposure, and they maintain that people can be exposed to 10 million microwatts per square meter, this time averaged over 30 minutes, which in practice means relaxation of the limits, and also 40 million microwatts per square meter for so-called local exposure. And those extreme levels can be compared to the recommendations made by other instances, such as the European Parliament in a STOA report, 100 microwatt per square meter, the Salzburg Health Department in 2002, 1 microwatt per square meter in sleeping areas. And the Bioinitiative report in 2012 recommended maximum limit of 3 to 6 microwatt per square meter. And the Europa EMF guidelines recommended in 2016 0.1 to 100 microwatt per square meter, depending on sensitivity and frequency. Next slide, please. Now, those limits that we have today in most countries over the world are very much higher than the limits that was in place in Eastern European countries already 50 years ago. In 1969, Karel Mara, who was then the director within the Institute of Industrial Hygiene and Occupational Diseases in Prague, Czechoslovakia, did a presentation at a symposium in Virginia. There he presented the results from studies that they had performed of workers exposed to RF radiation at more than 200 workplaces. And the conclusions made by from those studies was that the effects depend not only on the average power, but also on the peak power, that pulsed and polyfrequency signals were more harmful than continuous signals, that the effects were primarily neurologic, and that common symptoms reported by the exposed workers were pains in the head, in the eyes, in the muscles, in the heart, irregular heartbeat, fatigue, weakness, dizziness, vertigo, sleeping problems. And those very symptoms are the very same that are reported from people living close to base stations or mobile phone masts during the last 20 years, and that we have seen in our first case studies on 5G base station exposure. It was also concluded that women are more sensitive than men in general, and that there are large differences in sensitivity. So, based on, among others, those findings, the limit in those countries, in Eastern European countries, were 100 times lower than the ICNIRP limits. Next slide, please. And another interesting document is the Defense Intelligence Agency report from 1976 investigating scientific results from Eastern European countries. But it was concluded that if the more advanced nations of the West are strict in the enforcement of the lower limits that are adopted in the East European countries, that could have unfavorable effects on the industrial output and military functions. So this conclusion gives us the clue to why those ICNIRP and FCC limits are very strongly defended all over the years ever since. Next slide, please. ICNIRP is equal to the World Health Organization, or conversely, what the World Health Organization is equal to ICNIRP. It can be exemplified by this timeline. In 1992, ICNIRP was started, and the first chair was Michael Repakoli. In 1995 and 1996, the World Health Organization EMF project was launched, and the ICNIRP chair, Michael Repakoli, became the leader of this project, and he left the position as chair with ICNIRP. And in 1995, he already by then arranged so that the industry could fund the EMF project. The money was sent from the telecommunications industry to a hospital in Australia and then back to the World Health Organization. That was revealed in 2006, and you can read about it on the newsletter Microwave News, for instance, which is an excellent source for information about this issue. In 1997, Mr. Repakoli published a report, which was a study on long-term exposure of mice exposed to radio frequency mobile phone radiation. The mice was exposed to 2 30-minute periods per day for up to 18 months at levels below the ICNIRP limits. And the result was 2.4 higher risk for cancer in the exposed group compared to the unexposed. But that didn't stop Mr. Repakoli from issuing ICNIRP limits in 1998. He's one of the co-authors that completely ignored cancer risk from this kind of radiation exposure. And in 1998, he launched the World Health Organization EMF project, Harmonization Project, which was an effort to market and promote the ICNIRP limits as a world standard all over the world. According to Mr. Repakoli, this would give increased public confidence, reduce debate about and fears about EMF, and economic benefits to trade. That sounds very little to me to have anything to do with public health, but all to do with defending the industry interests. Next slide, please. In 1998, the medical doctor and former Prime Minister of Norway became the Director General of the World Health Organization. And in 2002, she told Norwegian newspapers that she got headache from mobile phone radiation. She was very sensitive. She couldn't tolerate the radiation from a mobile phone at 4 meters distance, so nobody could enter her office at the World Health Organization with a mobile phone off. And in 2015, she repeated the claim in another interview with a Norwegian newspaper. She said she had suffered from headache and other symptoms from mobile phone radiation for over 20 years. And no doubt, she said, there are health effects that has been shown in scientific reports. Next slide, please. The World Health Organization project today is still communicating the same attitude as 20 years ago, that there are no health effects that have been established as being caused by mobile phone use, and that there are no health effects from base stations or mobile phone masts. The project is led by Emily van Deventer, who is an electrical engineer and has no training in medicine. Next slide, please. Now, there are those who claim, particularly those from who are members of ICNIRP and also the industry, that the World Health Organization, the ICNIRP, the EU, and several national expert groups come to the same conclusion that there are no health effects from this kind of radiation. And here we can see the simple explanation for why that is the case. The World Health Organization recruits only experts. In principle, they are all members of ICNIRP. So it's no surprise that they come to the same conclusion as ICNIRP. The same is true for the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority Expert Group, the SSM that you can see here in the table. They are also made up of mostly experts from ICNIRP that come to the same conclusion, that there are no established health effects below the ICNIRP limits. Next slide, please. And the same is true for the European Commission that recommended the ICNIRP limits in 1999. Over the years, they have engaged experts within their expert groups called ICNIRP. First, it was ICNIRP 2007, and then it was ICNIRP 2009, and ICNIRP 2015, and all have come to the same conclusion that there are no established effects below the ICNIRP limits. And all those groups have been made up to a majority of ICNIRP members or persons with ties to ICNIRP, and also members of the ICES, which also recommend similar limits as ICNIRP, and that is an industry organization. Next slide, please. So this is a picture that illustrates how this is all being done. Why, as Maria Fersting, Vice Chair of ICNIRP 2019, says that the majority of scientists, institutions such as the World Health Organization, the European Union, and the national expert groups all agree there are no established health effects below the ICNIRP limits. That is because they are made up of the same people that are referring to each other reports in a closed circle, and we can call this this cartel of experts the ICNIRP cartel. Next slide, please. And one of the major influential industries in this issue is the Swedish infrastructure provider Ericsson, who is world leading in 5G infrastructure technology. And here we see an example of the industry interests behind the ICNIRP limits. In a presentation made by Christer Törnvik from Ericsson, it was stated that limits 100 times lower than ICNIRP make 5G rollout a major problem or impossible. The presentation is available on the link that you see in this slide. Next slide, please. And another example of the industry push for the ICNIRP limits is a brochure from GSM Association from 2021 that is pushing for the ICNIRP 2020 limits. It's a propaganda brochure for the ICNIRP limits on 34 pages. And as you can see, they refer to the World Health Organization that has since several decades been captured by industry, the telecommunications industry. Next slide, please. I'm sorry. So, there is a reason why they all agree. The World Health Organization, the European Union, and various national expert groups such as the Swedish Radiation Safety Authority, they engage to a majority ICNIRP experts who produce reports on which these organizations base their opinion and policies on. They exclude all scientists who do not agree with the old and false idea that ICNIRP limits are sufficient for the protection of public health, because they are never invited. In conclusion, I believe that it's rather clear that the limits from the FCC and the ICNIRP are not intended to protect human health, but rather to protect industry interests. It is also rather clear that there are some scientists who are dishonestly promoting the evidently false narrative that there are no harmful effects below the limits. Very often they are members of ICNIRP and they receive research funding from industry. These scientists dominate the most influential expert reviews, such as those for the World Health Organization and the European Union. The limits are severely outdated and extremely high. They allow exposure way above levels that is known to cause harm, and they are not based on any long-term studies that show that people can be exposed to those levels of radiofrequency or microwave radiation without harm. Thank you for your attention.